Hello, welcome to the Self-Learning Podcast by Dr. Sushma Singh. Let us start discussion on Unit 20, Gender and Development. Our topic is Critique of Development. Beginning with the anti-Vietnam War movement to the radical student movement in the USA and Europe, there were other events that were changing the world in the 60s. The growing environmental activism of the late 60s in the West and the Cultural Revolution in China with the massacre of the communists in Indonesia and other places, and the intensification of the Cold War, and finally the defeat of the US forces in Vietnam were shaping the face of an entirely new world. The hike in the oil prices shocked the first world economy, and there seemed to be a new confidence of the third world countries. On the other hand, the growing awareness of the issues and criticism by the women's movement gradually began to view the existing model of women's liberation critically. Esther Bishop's work, Women's Role in Economic Development, for example, was a major eye-opener. It argued that the economic work of the female is never accounted for in the analysis of the economic activities. Thus, the Green Revolution agricultural strategy was criticized. It was argued that it focused on technology and training of men, while conveniently forgetting the women whose work, quite a substantial economic activity in the fields, was considered non-consequential. On the theoretical domain, it meant there were efforts to bring about changes in the way of economic activity is perceived, and broadened the concerns and issues of women so as to include the women of the third world. It was now argued by the feminist group and the women's movement in various countries, as they took cognizance of the experience and aspirations of the middle class European white women, that some of the fundamental premises of the feminist movement was too limited. Any meaningful struggle for liberation, it was argued, must take into account the problems which women in the third world face in their day-to-day life. The poor women of the third world were doubly exploited. First, they are women, and second, they come from the third world and the poor background. Thus, the class and gender both fuse in them. Their issues were not merely related to domestic violence or demand for sexual choices, but to the very basic development item, that is education, health, and employment. They needed to come out of the vicious circle of poverty, which prevented them from even coming out of the tyranny of tradition. It began to be argued that for the end of the subordination of the female, the beginning should be made from the lower end, that is, poor women of the third world. On the other hand, there have been efforts by the United Nations since 1975, which was declared as the Women's Year, to bring the issues related to women in the major international forum and discuss the issues relating to their resolution even at the global level. As a result, there has been a real internationalization of the issues of women's development and freedom. The ensuing debate, in fact, forced many state and women movement to have a relook at their programs and priorities. The Indian case is worth considering as it has made major contributions. The women's movement flourished during the anti-colonial struggle. The fact that the Constitution had accepted equal rights to vote, other equalities was a vindication of the fact that national movement had accepted the basic ethos of equality in 1947 itself. The focus of post-independence movement was to get the state involved more and more into the development program in such ways as not to let women lag behind. It is for this reason they attacked the government to shed its welfarist approach. Since the mid-1970s, however, one can see two broad terrains in the women's movement. One that was part of the larger political economic movement and demanded more states' action in the issues of women. The other were the autonomous group, which took specific issues of women and organized people along those issues. Soon, sharp divergences began to appear as one could see that the autonomous groups began attacking the developmental role of the state. There have been strong criticisms of the ideas of development. The ideas of modern industrialism, nation state, and the scientific world view are closely associated with the idea of development, which was the newest of all. The criticism came that all of them have worked against women. They have, it argued, increased inequalities and deprived women of whatever control they earlier had over the resources of community or family. It is the modern state and its agencies which were supposed to have taken over those rights and powers. Similarly, the critic pointed out that the massive industrial complexes are antithetical to women's interest. Technical complexities and technological world militate against some of the basic features of women's nature and interest. Thus, the stream of environmental activism and one stream of feminism mingled and created a strong critique, which came to be known as ecofeminism. Some of the feminist authors have shown India's Green Revolution as a classic example of how development was anti-woman. In the 1950s to late 1970s, the Green Revolution swept the world. It focused on increasing food production through expanding the area under production and increasing yields from those areas already under production by using faster maturing and high yielding seed varieties and higher input such as the fertilizers and pesticides. It resulted in dramatic increases in the food production and increased standard of living in some regions, increasing in housing, electricity and transportation, etc. Critics of the Green Revolution have pointed out that it has brought uneven distribution of benefits, and its emphasis on new technologies in fact was creating more inequality between the men and women. This also resulted in monoculture, which meant less variety and therefore dependence on the market, thereby making the lives of women more difficult than before. Similarly, with monocultures, crops also have become more vulnerable to pests droughts, etc. And thus not only there is reduced food security at the local level, but also environmental hazard such as increased salinity, etc., begin to affect the life of the people. And in all, these women were a major casualty. The post-independent development in many ex-colonized countries was also seen from the prism of socialism. It was argued that the development was leading to a capitalist development, which does not augur well for women, as it was argued that capitalism is not only antithetical to gender justice development which is leading to capitalism, but also not conducive to women's well-being. They show as vindication of their point the widespread practice of women foeticides in some of the relatively more developed states like Punjab, Haryana and Gujarat in India. It was argued that during the 1950s and 60s, development was considered merely a technical problem of raising productivity by technological input. It is said to have been lacking both political or ideological and even policy dimensions whereby women and children could be brought under the rubrics of development. When women were included, they were more often than not confined to the reproductive roles, which was a stereotypical Western understanding of the third world woman. No agency was given to women to voice their own understanding and concerns. At a more basic level, they argued that initial concern for the equality between the woman and men was based on the Enlightenment ideas of a liberal Western world, which did not take into cognizance the women of the third world. Here, they were not only countering the male dominance but also poverty and other forms of the exploitation and inequality. Thus, the concern in even what emerged as the feminist studies also began shifting to poor women and poverty alleviation rather than welfarist or pure humanitarian concern. Women were now constructed as vulnerable or as victims and as invisible. Scholars and policy makers argued that one of the major reasons for the failure of different development projects was precisely this invisibility. Now let us wind up the session and take rest. Thank you very much for engaging yourself with a self-learning podcast.